You are officially invited. Yes, you. You're invited to join us in Fertility Awareness Mastery. This is my 10-week program designed to help you gain confidence using fertility awareness. Whether you're actively avoiding pregnancy or looking to optimize your cycles for conception, we have a spot for you. We start on April 23rd. Are you ready to jump in? Head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program to reserve your spot today. That's fertilityfriday.com/group program. This episode is brought to you by my very first book, The Fifth Vital Sign: Master Your Cycles and Optimize Your Fertility. With over 1,000 research citations, it is the most comprehensive resource on fertility awareness and the menstrual cycle to date. The Fifth Vital Sign is available for purchase on Amazon in ebook and paperback formats. Audio is coming. And you can grab the first chapter for free over at fertilityfriday.com/vital sign. That's fertilityfriday.com/vital sign. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 250. Welcome to the 250th episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I'm excited to share today's episode with you because in a way it's like a throwback. So when I first started the podcast, my very first episodes, I did 2 episodes. It was kind of like one long episode that I decided to split into 2. But when I very first started the podcast, I wanted to start with a bang. I wanted to share what is fertility awareness, and then I also wanted to share what some of the top myths are. So if you haven't, I know a lot of you go back and listen to all of the episodes, which is incredible. And I know a lot of you, when I talk to you, you'll say, oh, I haven't listened to all the episodes yet. And I think to myself, there is like 250 because today's episode is episode number 250. There's 250 episodes. I don't even know how many hours that is. It's a lot of hours of podcast. It's a lot of hours of my voice to listen to. But, to celebrate the 250th episode, it's a pretty big accomplishment. It's a nice milestone. So yay for Fertility Friday. But yeah, I thought I would do a bit of a throwback episode and talk about some of the biggest myths about fertility awareness. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while, I'm guessing that these myths will not come as a surprise to you. But for those of you who are newer listeners to the show or, just enthusiasts about fertility awareness, I'm sure that you will appreciate today's episode. And of course, as a reminder, I'm getting really excited about the April 10-week Fertility Awareness Mastery Group program. It's like my favorite thing to do this program because it gives me an opportunity to connect with women in the Fertility Friday community and to share the love of fertility awareness. Each woman who has graduated from the Fertility Awareness Mastery program gets to take this information for the rest of her life. And really, it changes the way that you look at your menstrual cycle. It changes the way that you advocate for yourself with health professionals when you have a deep understanding of your body. And also when you realize that your intuition and your bodily signs, the things that you can actually see and feel yourself, when you realize that those are valid and that they actually mean something. So when you realize that these changes in your menstrual cycle actually do mean something, when you have someone like me, educating you, every step of the way, then all of a sudden it gives you a lot more confidence to trust in your own intuition. It's interesting, the topics that regularly come up every time I run this program, because one of the side benefits that you wouldn't really think about that happens when you go through a program, when you go through my 10-week program, is that you gain a lot more confidence, not only to understand your cycle and understand fertility awareness and the nitty-gritty of it, charting your cervical mucus and understanding exactly which days are fertile, which days aren't, and all of that, really important information. But in addition to that, you're also gaining this ability to trust in your body, this ability to think about your body differently. So, whereas when you started the program, you might have thought that there's something wrong with your cycle if it's not falling within the parameters, like you're broken and something needs to be fixed. We can really shift that into understanding that when there's something off with your cycle, it's like a messenger. It's like a little internal secretary or messenger that's actually giving you information. And so we can take a more neutral stance on what we're observing in the menstrual cycle. And instead of always thinking the negative, like the worst, like there's something wrong with me, start to have an appreciation of how incredible our bodies are, because our bodies are so incredible that they're finding ways to communicate with us through our menstrual cycle. So, I could go on about that all day, but I will spare you the long ranty and just personally invite you to join us in my 10-week Fertility Awareness Mastery Group program. We're starting in a couple of weeks. We still have spots available. For more information, make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program. I would love to have you in there. Early bird pricing is still available for a couple of weeks, so make sure to jump in there and take advantage of that. And so I look forward to seeing you there. Now, without further ado, let's jump into today's episode. So let's jump into the top 5 myths about the fertility awareness method and the menstrual cycle. So first, I'll read through them and then we'll go through them one by one. So myth number 1 is that the rhythm method is the same as the fertility awareness method and therefore it doesn't work. That the menstrual cycle, number 2, is that the menstrual cycle is always 28 days and ovulation always happens on day 14. Number 3 is the myth that the menstrual cycle only matters when you're actively trying to have a baby. Myth number 4 is that the hormonal birth control regulates the menstrual cycle. And myth number 5 is that painful periods are normal. So let's jump in with myth number 1, that the fertility awareness method is the same as the rhythm method and therefore it doesn't work. And so I think it's helpful just to think about the main differences between the fertility awareness method and the rhythm method. And so first and foremost, the rhythm method is based on a mathematical calculation. When it comes to the rhythm method, it's based on the idea that the menstrual cycle is basically the same and it's always going to follow the same pattern. And as long as you can identify when ovulation happens in that particular cycle or in a few cycles, then it'll always happen at the same time. And so basically it's literally math. And we're saying, okay, the average of this number of cycles is this. Ovulation, on average happens this time. And then if we create a buffer around that, then we can identify the fertile window. However, the fertility awareness method is not based on mathematical calculations. The fertility awareness method is based on actual science and observations. So with the main difference between the rhythm method and the fertility awareness method is that the rhythm method doesn't involve you really looking at your body signs. It more so involves you understanding math and calculating an average and trying to predict ovulation. Whereas fertility awareness method, it's not about predicting ovulation. It's about figuring out on a day-to-day basis whether or not you're fertile based on your actual signs of fertility that day. And so, an analogy that I talk about in my book, The Fifth Vital Sign, is from one of my mentors, Rosie Chuck. She always says that it's like with the rhythm method, it's like relying on the weather forecast to tell you whether or not it's raining, whereas the fertility awareness method allows you to step outside and find out if it's actually raining right now. And that's the big difference. And furthermore, the fertility awareness method is based on science. And when you study the menstrual cycle, there's a number of different ways to do that. One of the ways to do that is to look at the research on women's menstrual cycles. So there's a number of studies whether it's population studies, some, have really large sample sizes, some have smaller sample sizes. But when you look at several thousand women and you measure their menstrual cycles and you measure, how long the menstrual cycles are. Some of the studies report on length. Some of them break down the menstrual cycle and look at the luteal phase and the pre-ovulatory phase to determine when ovulation happened in the cycle so that we can have an understanding of the different phases of the cycle. But however you look at it, the largest studies on the menstrual cycle that have ever been done, or studies that are looking at several thousand women and their menstrual cycles, always find that, all women have one thing in common, and that is menstrual cycle variability. And the most variable phase of the menstrual cycle is the pre-ovulatory phase. Now, we can break up the menstrual cycle into 2 broad categories. We can look at the pre-ovulatory phase, which is it begins the first day of your period, and it goes up until ovulation. And then the second half of the menstrual cycle is from ovulation until your next period. And the most variable part of your menstrual cycle is the part before ovulation. And that's because our bodies are highly intelligent and extremely receptive to all of the different factors that are happening in our lives. So whether we're talking about regular day-to-day events such as stress or travel or those types of things, or all the way to endocrine disorders, disruptions, if you have a thyroid issue, if you have a metabolic issue like with polycystic ovary syndrome, if you have gut issues, underlying infections that are causing, different challenges health-wise, regardless of what it is, all of those types of things will show up in your menstrual cycle, and they can affect the whole cycle, but they typically have the strongest effect on ovulation, meaning that if you experience like a temporary stressor or something like that, your ovulation could be delayed for a couple of days. If you have a serious issue with your gut health and you're exposed to some foods that you're sensitive to or allergic to or whatever the case is, it can cause such a significant inflammatory reaction in your gut that it can actually delay ovulation. So, however it looks, the pre-ovulatory phase is highly variable. And with that said, that means that when you're charting your menstrual cycles, if you're using the rhythm method is based on a mathematical calculation. So it's not taking into account the regular fluctuations that we would expect to see from cycle to cycle. Whereas the fertility awareness method is actually looking at your menstrual cycles and from a day-to-day basis. It's based on observing your signs of fertility. And so the main signs of fertility are your cervical mucus, your basal body temperature changes, and your cervical position changes. And so when you're monitoring those three signs, you can actually ask yourself at the end of every day, am I fertile or not today based on what I saw today? And essentially on the days that you observe cervical mucus, as you approach ovulation, those are your days of fertility, and those shift. So for any woman who's been charting her menstrual cycles for any length of time, whether that's 3 months, 6 months, a year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, like in my case, I've been charting for almost 20 years. What you'll find is that there are fluctuations and there are changes. And we're really, the main difference is that with fertility awareness, what you have to wrap your head around is that you can't predict ovulation. Ovulation can vary. Even if you've never had an early ovulation or a late ovulation, it is possible that your next cycle, you could ovulate earlier or later. And so you then, instead of trying to predict ovulation, have to actually be observing your fertile signs to see. You want to step outside and see if it's actually raining. That reminds me of another myth that I wasn't planning to focus on today, so I'm not going to go into it too deeply. But the myth that, fertility awareness only works if your menstrual cycles are really regular. That myth is rooted in the rhythm method because, again, not understanding the difference between the rhythm method and the fertility awareness method. So if you believe that the fertility awareness method is the rhythm method and the point is to understand when you're ovulating and to predict it, then it would make sense that it wouldn't work if your cycles are irregular. But when you understand that fertility awareness involves actually observing and charting your fertile signs on a day-to-day basis, and the fertility awareness method is rooted in science, and when you're looking at the science, it's very clear that there are fluctuations in the menstrual cycle that we account for. So the fertility awareness method allows you to account for those changes so that if you do have an early or late ovulation, you're already checking for your cervical mucus. And so if you have an early ovulation, you're going to start seeing your mucus earlier. If you have a later ovulation, you might start seeing your mucus later, or you might end up having 2 patches of mucus. But when you're checking for your fertile signs each day, you're accounting for that because you're actually acknowledging how your body works and you're looking for your signs of fertility. And so just as a side note, I've talked about cervical mucus a ton on the podcast, so I'll link a couple episodes about cervical mucus so that you can have more information. And of course, I have an entire chapter on cervical mucus in the 5th vital sign. But basically, cervical mucus is the central part of understanding your cycles and understanding fertility awareness because it's your cervical mucus that keeps sperm alive for up to 5 days and therefore signifies when you're in your fertile window. So this is very different than just doing a mathematical calculation. This is very, very different from, identifying ovulation in a couple of cycles and then doing like a mathematical average and then guessing which days you're probably going to ovulate on. And that is why fertility awareness has an effectiveness rate as high as 99.4% when used correctly. And so that particular study uses the symptothermal method. And so I've talked about the study a number of times on the show, but the participants of that study essentially were trained in a specific method of fertility awareness charting by instructors who are certified in that method. So they understand how to use the method correctly. They understand that there are rules. And so there's a difference between having a general understanding of your body versus actually practicing a specific method of fertility awareness charting as a birth control method, for example. And so when you're charting, you understand that there are rules. You understand that, the days of cervical mucus are fertile, but we have to add a buffer period onto that to make sure that we confirm ovulation. And we do that by monitoring your cervical mucus patterns as well as your basal body temperature, because after ovulation, your temperature rises and stays high. And so it's quite literally like an N of 1. You get to have a monthly science experiment where you can focus on your signs of fertility, and that really guides you to understanding when in your cycle you're fertile, when you're not, and how it all works together. So I think that we have addressed the first myth that fertility awareness is not the same as the rhythm method, and all the different reasons why. And I suppose, my favorite reason is that it's the science versus like a mathematical equation designed to predict ovulation. So two completely different things. So number 2, the second myth I wanted to talk about today is that the myth that the menstrual cycle is always 28 days and that ovulation always happens on day 14. Now, we've already alluded to this myth when we covered myth number 1. And we alluded to it just basically by talking about the research on the menstrual cycle. And so I've seen this play out both ways. I've extensively researched the menstrual cycle and looked at the scientific literature where they're analyzing thousands of women and analyzing, tens of thousands of menstrual cycles for data and really giving us some insight into what a true menstrual cycle looks like and what the parameters are and how it changes. So one thing that's really interesting is that the length of the menstrual cycle, it does vary, from cycle to cycle, but it also varies throughout the reproductive life. And so, in chapter 4 of the 5th vital sign, I talk about the normal parameters of a healthy menstrual cycle in a way that is really helpful because as women, we're not really provided with a lot of data as to what is normal in the menstrual cycle. And it leaves us with the impression that if our cycles are anything other than 28 days, it necessarily means that there is a problem and that there's something wrong with us. And so when we look at the research, studies that are looking at tens, if not hundreds of thousands of menstrual cycles over several years, there's one particular study that researched women's menstrual cycles, and they looked at women. The study results provide the menstrual cycle, information about the menstrual cycles of women from menarche to menopause. So it's a really incredible study because you can actually see the patterns of the menstrual cycle throughout the reproductive life. And so this study, tens of thousands of menstrual cycles. Actually, I think if I remember correctly, it was 250,000 menstrual cycles. And so thousands of women contributed data to this particular study. So this is just one of a variety of different studies that have looked at the menstrual cycle in great detail. So what's interesting is that there is no woman on earth that has a 28-day menstrual cycle every single cycle from the time that she has her first period to the last one. It's not real. So what happens is, as a young lady, when you first start to menstruate, so when you reach menarche and you have your first period, it's quite typical for the menstrual cycles to take several years to fully mature and become robust. And it makes sense. If I think back to puberty, many years ago, I didn't just one day I had a flat chest and the next day I had breasts. It took several years for my breasts to develop. And even then, once I many years later became pregnant and had my first son, my breasts then continued to mature again, and they are now also different to when they were in puberty. So we can appreciate that the development process, the process from girl to woman, takes some time. With that in mind, it makes perfect sense that it would take the menstrual cycle, meaning the communication between our hypothalamus, pituitary ovaries, our ovaries themselves are reproductive organs and systems. It makes sense that it would take a couple of years before those systems are fully developed. And it's reflected in the data. So when we look at the data of the menstrual cycle over periods of time for women in that stage of life, women during that first 5 years after their very first period are much more likely to have longer menstrual cycles. And so where I say, an average cycle, a healthy cycle actually ranges from anywhere from 24 to 35 days, that's of a grown woman. A woman who is in those first couple of years after her first period, the average is closer to anywhere from 21 to 45 days. And that's because it often takes some time for the menstrual cycle to develop, and it takes some time for everything to become robust and normal and regular. So, there's that. So the first 5 years or so, statistically speaking, the menstrual cycles varying quite a bit more. Then once we reach that kind of phase of like we're grown now, our our cycles have had a chance to mature, our organs and everything, like we're no longer in puberty, we are now grown women and our bodies have matured. Then we hit a more stable point. But again, the range is still somewhere between 24 and 35 days, on average, for a healthy menstrual cycle. And so there's variation, a lot more variation during those first 5 years after you get your first period. And then there's still variation throughout our adult lives. And this is not talking about the variation that would be caused by, endocrine issues, health issues, using hormonal birth control. This is just talking about women in general, just healthy women who are just menstruating and ovulating normally. And then once we hit that 10-year period before our very last menstrual cycle. So menopause is the word for the last period, essentially, for when it stops. And the 10 years before we hit menopause, that's our, pre-menopause or perimenopause. And during those 10 years, it's not uncommon for our cycles to start fluctuating again. And so many women experience a period of time when their cycles shorten. So they're ovulating a lot earlier in the menstrual cycle. So their cycles might go from being 27 days or 28 or 29 days to being closer to 24, 23, 21, 22 days. And then, especially during the last 2 years before you hit your very last menstrual period, it's not uncommon then for the cycles to start lengthening. And so for you to start going, several months between periods up until you hit menopause, which is defined by, not having your period for a full year. So as before I talked about all this data, what I was saying was that there's no woman on earth that has 28-day cycles throughout her entire life, because we go through all these different phases, as I was talking about with regards to our cycle maturation process. And then also as we approach menopause, the winding down of our menstrual cycles. So we have to put that myth to rest as well, because there's a lot of problems. So there's specific issues with, believing that the menstrual cycle is always 28 days. One of them I see in women who are actively trying to conceive, because then when you're specifically timing sex based on this idea that your menstrual cycle is always 28 days and always ovulation is going to happen on day 14, there are a number of women who miss out on their fertile window because they're trying to have sex on day 14. Now, if there's a normal degree of variation in the menstrual cycle, and if some women ovulate earlier and some women ovulate later, then there's going to be some women who are literally like waiting too long, missing their fertile window if they're waiting till day 14. And there's other women for whom day 14 might be too early. And again, they're missing out on their fertile window. So really and truly, what fertility awareness and understanding how your cycle works, what that does is it allows you to have a much better understanding of what's actually happening, for you to recognize that, fluctuation in the menstrual cycle is normal, and then for you to figure out what's happening with you. And instead of looking for the magical day of ovulation, we start to recognize that the true sign of fertility are the days that you're making cervical mucus. So let's move on to myth number 3. Myth number 3 is that the menstrual cycle only matters when you're actively trying to have a baby. And so this is, the analogy that I use in the fifth vital sign, and that I'm sure I've talked about on the podcast before, is just the concept that as a woman, there's this weird idea that we're just like men with ovaries or something like that, or that our bodies are basically the same as men, except we have this wild card of ovulation and menstruation. But no, we're not men, we're women, and it's a different thing. So for biological women with menstrual cycles, we are not the same as men. We are our own individuals. We have a different physiology, and we're still human beings. It's not like our physiology, it's not like we're aliens or something like that. So I'm not saying that our physiology is so different to the point that, we can't even compare them, but we have a completely different hormonal structure and system, because we have the ability to grow babies and support life. I suppose talking about the birth control pill helps to illustrate how we typically think in our culture about our menstrual cycles and about our reproductive system. So when you're taking hormonal birth control, the vast majority of hormonal birth control, what they do is suppress ovulation. Now, ovulation isn't suppressed with every single type of birth control, but the vast majority. So whether we're talking about the pill, the patch, the ring, the shot, the implant, and the IUD, like the hormonal IUD, to some degree, some women do continue to ovulate when they're using the hormonal IUD, but some women do not. And for other women, their ovulation is disrupted. So again, the primary, for the vast majority of birth control types, the primary mode of action is to fully suppress ovulation, to stop our ovaries from releasing an egg every month. And somehow we have this idea that if we do that, it's not going to have an impact beyond our ability to reproduce. And this speaks to that idea that it seems to be kind of, we may not be aware that that's what we're thinking, but basically that's kind of the idea that's presented to us, that if you're not trying to have a baby, then having regular periods isn't really that important. So we can really just put your fertility on the shelf for 20 years by taking hormonal birth control, and it's not really going to have an impact on any other area of your life. And so, the only way that we can believe that is if we think that somehow it's separate from us, or somehow it doesn't have an effect. Somehow, the estrogen and the progesterone that we produce during our menstrual cycle only impacts our fertility, and it has no other impacts on our health, which is not true. And so, one of the driving forces for me writing The Fifth Vital Sign, for me starting this podcast, for me talking about these issues over all these years, is to help us to reclaim our menstrual cycles and to help us to understand that they are important. Because when you, as someone in my position as a fertility awareness educator, I'm working with women, we're charting the cycle, and you can see it. Whether it's something small, like a stressful day or a stressful event at work, to an actual health issue, as we've talked about already today, these things show up in the menstrual cycle, and you can see it. You can, for many women who are charting, it's what they see in the menstrual cycle that can be the earliest sign, earliest indication, because in the menstrual cycle, sometimes it can be so subtle. You'll notice it if you're actively charting and working with someone like me who can pick up on these things. But, it can show up so subtly in the menstrual cycle before you ever have these overt symptoms of a big condition or something like that. So in my world, it's very, very obvious how closely the menstrual cycle is connected to health. But, outside of that, we don't really have that understanding. We have to use examples to illustrate it. And if you look at some of the specific issues that can interfere with menstrual cycle regularity, then it becomes more clear. So, for instance, when women stop menstruating altogether, in the case of hypothalamic amenorrhea, which is associated with a combination of, over-exercise, under-nutrition, so not eating enough food, and stress. And, in those cases, then, when a woman stops menstruating, it's a sign that her body is essentially in a state of chronic undernutrition or chronic stress, or a combination of the two. And one of the side effects, one of the results, one of the things that happens when women lose their periods is that they start to rapidly lose bone mass, and it puts them at an increased lifetime risk of developing osteoporosis. We're not really taught to care about our menstrual cycles, but if our menstrual cycles are attached to our bone health, then all of a sudden it's like, well, wow, I thought that it was only about having babies, but it looks as though, our menstrual cycles are connected to our physiology in other ways. So even the way that our bones are formed and developed, it's directly related to our monthly menstrual cycles. The estrogen that we produce as we approach ovulation, and the progesterone that we only produce after we ovulate, if we ovulate, have direct impact on our bone mass. And when we stop ovulating, it affects our ability to produce bone, and we rapidly start depleting it. And so I'll link to the episodes I've recorded with Dr. Jerry Lynn Pryor, because in her work highlights the importance of progesterone in bone health. And, it wasn't until I started researching the effect of the menstrual cycle on bone health that I started to realize that the majority of the researchers focus only on estrogen and don't even look at the impact of progesterone on bone health, which is just incredibly short-sighted, because, progesterone, we produce significant quantities of it for the second half of the menstrual cycle, and clearly plays a really important role in bone health. And so in addition to that, women who have irregular menstrual cycles are more likely to are at an increased risk of cardiovascular health issues. And polycystic ovary syndrome is a prime example of that. Women who, one of the characteristic signs of polycystic ovary syndrome in the menstrual cycle is having irregular periods, and legitimately irregular, not having a 32-day cycle sometimes, but having cycles that vary widely. So more than 8 days from cycle to cycle. Perhaps one cycle is 27 days, and the next cycle is 42 days, and the next cycle is 53 days, and the next cycle is 35 days, and it really just varies widely. Women who experience that type of cycle disruption are at increased risk for developing cardiovascular issues, are at an increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes, as is the case of polycystic ovary syndrome, having those cardiometabolic risk factors. And so this is something, again, this is not about necessarily your ability to have a baby. This is about your overall health. And so again, the myth is that it only matters to have healthy cycles when you're trying to get pregnant. A lot of women do have issues with their periods and they go to their practitioners and perhaps they have irregular ovulation or they've lost their period and their practitioners are telling them to go on the pill. I just had a woman message me a couple of days ago and she's like, I just found your podcast and website and book and all of that information. She said, I hadn't had my period for 6 months and I went to my doctor and my doctor just put me on the pill and told me that that was fine and that was how you address it. And she said, I had this feeling like there was something wrong. And then when I found your information, it really helped me to figure out like, oh my goodness, there could be a bigger issue going on here. But this is where we're at. This is the current standard of care for women where we're not really looking deeper and we're really only treating the menstrual cycle as essentially irrelevant unless we're trying to have babies. And it's interesting because it's not just when you have babies that you want to be healthy. You should be able to be healthy all the time. But the first step is really recognizing that the menstrual cycle is a sign of health. So in reproductive age women, biological women with menstrual cycles, having a regular healthy menstrual cycle is a sign of health. And that's the first thing that we need to kind of wrap our heads around. Technically, in a perfect world, our practitioners would be looking at the menstrual cycle first and foremost. That would be something that we would be checking in about. Because if the menstrual cycle is off, that would give the practitioner an early warning sign like, hey, if you're only menstruating once every 3 months, that's a big sign that there's something else going on. And we need to be looking into that because, this is putting you at risk for additional health issues outside of whether or not you're going to want to have kids in the future. That simple conversation could be so helpful to millions of women around the world who struggle with menstrual cycle irregularities. All right. Oh, and then I suppose one last thing I thought of just to put in there is that if you do have these menstrual cycle issues and irregularities and you are put on birth control, to quote unquote, we'll get to the regulation thing, but to quote unquote regulate the cycle, then what happens when you do want to have babies? Because ultimately, the pill and all these types of hormonal birth control, they don't actually address or fix or cure or anything. They don't fix anything. They basically shut down your menstrual cycle and replace it with a fake bleed to give you the impression that something is being done when nothing's really being done. So when you're ready to have children, that issue that you had was never addressed. So then when you come off of hormonal birth control, the issue is still there and you still have to figure out how to address it. So really it just delays what should have happened from the beginning, which is to actually address the health issue. Because if you want to conceive and have a healthy baby, you have to be able to ovulate and have menstrual cycle. So this is a really big issue. So I'm going to stop. So that's the end of number 3. I just wanted to tag that little bit in there. So let's move on to myth number 4. So myth number 4 is that hormonal birth control regulates the menstrual cycle. Yeah. So I think we've alluded to this as well, but I just read an article today and I held my tongue. I didn't say anything, but the article was really, really good. I'm not going to say what it is or anything, so I don't want to call people out on air, but I was reading an article and it was a really great article about hormonal birth control and really jumping into the conversation that has been happening about hormonal birth control, especially within the last couple of years. So it's really coming out that hormonal birth control is linked to a ton of side effects. We've talked about pretty much all of them that I could think of on the podcast. It's related to side effects from nutrient deficiencies, from an increased risk of depression to, shrinkage of the vulvar tissues, which we've talked about, and reducing ovarian reserve parameters, ovarian shrinkage, reducing, a temporary delay in the return of your normal fertility. It has an effect on the menstrual cycle. It goes on and on, right? Like we've talked about a lot of these effects on the podcast over the years. But so the article that I was looking at, they opened by saying that, the pill tricks your body into thinking that you're pregnant and as a result stops you from ovulating. And I feel like that goes hand in hand with this idea that hormonal birth control regulates the menstrual cycle. Both of those statements are wrong. Hormonal birth control does not regulate the menstrual cycle. It suppresses the menstrual cycle. It prevents you from having a menstrual cycle. It stops your pituitary gland from communicating with your hypothalamus and your ovaries, therefore stopping you from ovulating. It puts your ovaries to sleep. The hormonal state of a woman on hormonal birth control more closely resembles the hormonal state of a woman in menopause. Because when you are in menopause, your ovaries are also inactive and you're not producing significant amounts of your natural estrogen and progesterone. So, when you're taking hormonal birth control, you have an influx of these artificial hormones. They are not the same as the hormones that we produce. these hormones are not even produced in nature. They're completely created. They're man-made hormones. They're made in a lab, and they can't be the same as our natural hormones because you can't patent natural hormones and make money off of them. So they have to create a different hormone that is similar enough that we can still call it an estrogen, but different enough that they can put a patent on it and sell it to make money off of it. So they're not the same as our hormones. They're not even found in nature. And so we have these synthetic estrogens and progestins. Because they're not the same as our natural hormones, they have different effects in the body. When we have these hormones, these artificial hormones, when we're taking them, what they do is that, they suppress ovulation. And so your natural hormone production is dramatically lower. You're barely producing any of your own natural estrogen, and you're producing basically none of your natural progesterone. And so that would most closely mimic the state of menopause in the body, because pregnancy is a healthy, natural, normal state in the body. When a woman is pregnant, so if you have been pregnant or if you may be pregnant in the future, or are pregnant right now, what happens is that you produce a significant amount of estrogen and progesterone, your natural hormones, to the point that it's almost like a third stage of development. So, we talked a little bit about puberty and how the menstrual cycle and your reproductive organs and all of these things grow and develop and mature during that time. The reason that they're growing is because you are producing a significant amount of hormone. And these hormones that we naturally produce in puberty, that is what guides the cell growth and development. That is what changes us into, men or women, depending on what's happening biologically. And so pregnancy is another time where we're exposed to a really high level of our natural hormones. So during pregnancy, you're producing high levels of estrogen and high levels of progesterone. And in fact, by the time you hit 40 weeks of pregnancy, your progesterone levels are over 10 or 11 times the highest levels you would ever see during a normal menstrual cycle. 10 or 11 times the amount of progesterone is coursing through your veins. And so if you think about that, what happens in pregnancy? Well, first of all, you grow a tiny human. But second of all, your body goes through all these changes. When you go through pregnancy, your breasts physiologically shift and change to be able to produce milk. So, ask any woman who's gone through pregnancy and she'll tell you that her body is different, fundamentally changed forever after pregnancy. That is not what happens on the pill. That's not the same. So to say that the pill mimics the state of pregnancy, that's not a real thing. And it's very misleading because it makes it seem like the pill is mimicking a natural state in the body. Like it makes it seem like the pill is basically doing something natural to us, but it's completely artificial and it's not the same. So you can probably hear my but it's true. And it drives me nuts because that's not what it does. Pregnancy is a natural state in the body. It's a healthy state in the body. There is research that shows that when a woman, if a woman becomes pregnant in her early 20s and carries a baby to term, her lifetime risk of breast cancer is reduced significantly, dramatically because of the changes that take place in her body due to these hormones, because pregnancy is like another stage of development. Yeah, that's not what the pill does. It doesn't do that. So we shouldn't be saying that it mimics pregnancy, and we shouldn't be saying that it regulates the cycle. So the pill then, for the record, it replaces your regular healthy menstrual cycle with it suppresses your cycle basically, and it replaces it with a fake hormonal cycle, which isn't a cycle at all. And instead of having ovulation and a true menstrual bleed, you end up having a withdrawal bleed, meaning that when you take those 4 or 7 days off of if you're having the sugar pills, or if you have to take out the ring or take off the patch or whatever the case is, then you're getting a withdrawal bleed, which is not the same. Yeah, because in order to have a true menstrual bleed, you have to actually ovulate, and then you would have a period after that. Okay. So that's myth number 4, that the birth control pill regulates the menstrual cycle. And I threw in a bonus myth, which is that the pill mimics pregnancy. And then the last myth that we'll be talking about today is the myth that period pain is normal. And I wanted to throw that in there because as someone who experienced period pain for years, I have a heart for women who are experiencing period pain. In my line of work, I talk to women every day. I'm always working with women. I work with women in my group classes, one-on-one classes, and I've been doing this for a really long time. And so I've noticed certain patterns. one of the things I've noticed is that, women, we're pretty tough. We can handle a lot of pain. I don't know if this is good or bad, to be honest with you, but as women, we can handle a lot of pain. And what I've also noticed is that as women, we have a tendency to downplay our own pain for a couple of reasons. One, because we've just got such a high pain tolerance, but another, because we always know that there's someone out there that has it worse. So even if your pain is like 8 or 9 on the pain scale, it's excruciating and it feels like someone's trying to tear your insides out, you know that there's some woman out there who actually throws up when she has her period. So mine can't be that bad because I didn't throw up. And over the years, I've come to realize that I have to actively ask women, to describe their pain and to tell me how bad it is. Because if I don't, then, they're much more likely to just pass it off as if it's just not that bad. For women who have really serious pain, who've gone to their practitioners about it, again, we all know what happens. Often we're given the pill or we're just given painkillers, and no one's really saying like, it's not normal for you to be in so much pain that you're doubled over and you can't walk. No one's saying that. And I feel as women, we just need someone to finally say it. Like someone needs to say it. It is not normal to be in so much pain that you can't walk. It's not normal for you to be in so much pain that you can't go to work. It's not normal for you to be in so much pain that you have to take 3-4 ibuprofen just to go through the day. Someone has to say it. So I'm saying it. It's really common, unfortunately. A lot of women have pain with their periods, but there's a difference between what's common and what's normal. And someone has to say it. So severe pain with menstruation is, women who have severe pain with menstruation are more likely to have a condition like endometriosis. Severe pain is associated with increased inflammation, increased prostaglandin production. Prostaglandins are what make our uterus contract, and we need them in order for us to have a normal period, in order for that to flow normally. But women who have severe pain have been shown to have upwards of 4 times as much prostaglandins, which are a sign of inflammation. So when you're having significant amounts of pain, it's a sign that you have too much inflammation in your body. And that can be a result of a combination of things. It could just be a result of modern life with our normal modern foods, eating processed foods that are high in omega-6 fatty acids, as opposed to having a balance of omega-3 and omega-6. It can be a result of eating the conventional foods that are available to us, whether that's conventional dairy products that are, when we go to the grocery store, we just buy milk. It's typically cows that have the A1 beta casein, a protein that is associated with inflammation and a whole host of other issues, including autoimmune issues. But in addition to that, when you go to the grocery store and you buy conventional milk, these cows are often fed genetically modified grains. They're fed corn, and soy, and that's not even a cow's typical diet. Cows are supposed to eat grass. So, the milk that they produce is a lot more inflammatory, containing significantly higher amount of omega-6 fatty acids compared to omega-3. This also is connected to the meat that we eat. A lot of the conventional meat is highly inflammatory, and you can look at the research. They've studied the difference between grass-fed meat and, grain-fed meat, and they have completely different fatty acid profiles. So we live in a world that is predisposing us to high levels of inflammation. Those are just 2 examples. We haven't even gotten into the xenoestrogen exposure, all the chemicals that we're around, and all the different things that interfere with our normal hormone production and our normal hormone cycles. So yeah, period pain is really common, yes. But is it normal? No. Is it normal? How can you say that it's normal for a woman to be in so much pain that she has to take, painkillers every single time she has her period? Yes, common. No, not normal. And so again, it's really important for us to open that conversation. I'll link the interview that I recorded with Laura Owen. In that interview, she talked about the research on endometriosis, and it's not nice. The research shows that a woman who has endometriosis, it typically takes, 8 years in the United Kingdom for her to receive a diagnosis of endometriosis. So 8 years of her experiencing, a lot of pain. And in the United States, it was an average of 12 years. An average of 12 years for a woman to be experiencing such painful periods that she can barely function in some cases. She's going to her practitioners and no one's looking into it. All I have to say is that if there was a condition that caused men to experience like a burning pain in their penises that felt like someone was reaching inside their penis and trying to rip out their urethra, No one is waiting 12 years to diagnose that. So there's a much bigger problem going on. And so again, someone has to talk about it. Someone has to say it. And apparently it has to be us. So as women, we have to demand better. We have to acknowledge and really trust in our body's signs. We have to recognize that, the menstrual cycle is a vital sign. That includes a period. And that means that if your periods are so painful, or even if they're just like, because I know I'm describing the worst case scenario here. So there's a lot of you that are like, well, my periods aren't that bad. Yeah, I've got to take an ibuprofen or two, but it's totally fine. You know what? At the end of the day, we have to start acknowledging that pain is real, and why is it okay? Any other situation outside of menstruation, if you were experiencing that degree of pain, would it be okay? Imagine if it was in your back, or imagine if it was, imagine if a man had that. Imagine if, a man was walking around, all of a sudden he had like a stomach ache that was equivalent to your period pain. Do you think he would think that it was okay? Sometimes we just have to think about things in a different way and reframe the situation before we really start to recognize, wait a minute, this is a big deal. This is serious. So just like any other aspect of your menstrual cycle, painful periods are giving you information about your health. And if you're experiencing them, it's a sign. It can be a sign of inflammation. It could be just an indication to you that you need to slow down, that you need to look at your diet. You need to cut the sugar consumption. You need to look at the chemical exposure. You need to, look at your nutrient intake to make sure that you're obtaining sufficient nutrients in all areas. But either way, we have to look at it as a legitimate sign of something. We can't just ignore painful periods and act like it's normal, even though that's kind of like the myth that we've been fed from the time we were small. Okay. So that brings me to the end of my top 5 myths today. Good thing I stopped at 5, or we could have been here all day. So I'll go through the 5 again. So we talked about myth number 1, the myth that the fertility awareness method is the same as the rhythm method and that therefore it doesn't work, which is not true. We talked about myth number 2, which is that the menstrual cycle is always 28 days and ovulation always happens on day 14, which is not true. We talked about the myth that the menstrual cycle only matters when you're trying to have a baby. Again, not true. The menstrual cycle matters all the time because it's a sign of health. Number 4, we talked about the myth that hormonal birth control regulates the menstrual cycle, and I threw in the bonus myth that a hormonal birth control mimics a state of pregnancy. And number 5, the myth that period pain is totally normal and completely fine, and we should all just put up with it for the rest of our lives. Again, not true. So I want to hear your thoughts about these myths. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Were there some points that you have a different opinion about? I mean, this is all about sparking discussion and having an opportunity to talk about these issues, because as women, these are the issues that affect our day-to-day lives. It's really important. Any woman who has a menstrual cycle knows that these are the things that matter to us. We want to have healthy cycles. We want to be healthy people. That's how this works. And so we'll be talking about it in the Fertility Friday Facebook. So come over and join us. You'll find us over at fertilityfriday.com/community. I mentioned a number of different podcast episodes that I will link in the show notes page, which you'll find at fertilityfriday.com/250. For more on these topics, I really cover these topics extensively in The Fifth Vital Sign, which is available on Amazon. You'll in both paperback and ebook formats. The audio I'm finalizing, so it will be available soon, and you'll be the first to know when it does become available. And if you're wanting to jump in and grab the first chapter for free, you can get it at fertilityfriday.com/vitalsign. And, I just want to remind you that registration is open for Fertility Awareness Mastery, which is my 10-week group program. I'm so excited to get started in April. It's going to be a lot of fun. I always have an amazing mix of women, and I always say I attract the nicest, sweetest women to me whenever I run these programs. And so every time I've run these programs in the last couple of years, we've filled up. We've filled up all the spaces. So if you're wanting to join us, make sure to jump in early. Make sure to jump in before the end of March so that you can take advantage of early bird pricing. And with that, I just want to thank you for listening. Thank you for spending some time with me today, for being part of the Fertility Friday community. I really appreciate all of you for helping to spread the word on the importance of body literacy and fertility awareness, so that as women, we can just, become empowered with this basic knowledge of our menstrual cycles that we should always have had. So thank you for being a part of that. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.